Good morning. It is Monday, January 28th, and this is The Drill. Thank you very much. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States of America today, because I'm the only one that makes the presumption for the status quo. Once upon a time, the teacher of Moses called upon mankind with a warning. At a certain date, he said, all the water in the world which had not been specially hoarded would disappear. It would then be renewed with different water, which would drive men mad. Only one man listened to the meaning of this advice. He collected water and went to a secure place where he stored it and waited for the water to change its character. On the appointed date, the stream stopped running, the walls went dry, and the man who had listened, seeing this happening, went to his retreat and drank his preserved water. When he saw from his security the waterfalls again beginning to flow, this man descended among the other sons of men. He found that they were thinking and talking in an entirely different way from before, yet they had no memory of what had happened, nor of having been warned. When he tried to talk to them, he realized that they thought he was mad, and they showed hostility or pity, not understanding. At first, he drank none of the new water, but went back to his concealment to draw on his supplies every day. Finally, however, he took the decision to drink the new water because he could not bear the loneliness of living, behaving, and thinking in a different way from everyone else. He drank the new water and became like the rest. Then he forgot all about his own store of special water, and his fellows began to look upon him as a madman who had miraculously been restored to sanity. And that is called, When the Waters Were Changed. And it is from a book, Idris Shah, Tales of the Dervishes. And again, it's relevant because it's basically the struggle that's going on, the fundamental or essential struggle going on in the United States of America today, a struggle not of politics, but of sanity. So when I come back, I'm going to be reading from Ayn Rand's lexicon, and then also we're going to cover the there's the rules for radicals defeated, and he's going to go into the 11 ethical conundrums, so to speak, that Saul Alinsky, it's actually ends and means, the 11 ends and means that Saul Alinsky brings up. So when we come back. Thank you very much. The Ayn Rand lexicon, and today's concept of the day is errors of knowledge versus breaches of morality. Learn to distinguish the difference between errors of knowledge and breaches of morality. An error of knowledge is not a moral flaw, provided you are willing to correct it. Only a mystic would judge human beings by the standard of an impossible, automatic omniscience. But a breach of morality is the conscious choice of an action you know to be evil, or a willful evasion of knowledge, a suspension of sight and of thought. That which you do not know is not a moral charge against you, but that which you refuse to know is an account of infamy growing in your soul. Make every allowance for errors of knowledge. Do not forgive or accept any breach of morality. Give the benefit of the doubt to those who seek to know, but treat as potential killers those specimens of insolent depravity who make demands upon you, announcing they have and seek no reasons. Announcing that they have and seek no reasons, proclaiming as a license that they just feel it. Or those who reject an irrefutable argument by saying, it's only logic, which means it's only reality. The only realm opposed to reality is the realm and premise of death. And that was Errors of Knowledge versus Breaches of Morality from the Ayn Rand lexicon. So when I come back, I'm going to be reading, it's going to be a fairly extensive reading from The Rules for Radicals Defeated. Thank you very much. Welcome back. And Rules for Radicals Defeated in this section of the chapter is called Alinsky's 11 Rules of the Ethics of Means and Ends. Alinsky proposes 11 rules concerning the ethics of means and ends. I list them here with a short comment about each. I will explain what I believe to be the problems and inconsistencies with Alinsky's argument, followed by a discussion of the morality of using the Alinsky tactics ourselves. Quote, I present here a series of rules pertaining to the ethics of means and ends. First, that one's concern with the ethics of means and ends varies inversely with one's personal interest in the issue. Accompanying this rule is the parallel one that one's concern with the ethics of means and ends varies inversely with one's distance from the scene of conflict, unquote. In his first rule concerning the ethics of ends and means, Alinsky is addressing the, quote, not in my backyard, unquote, idea of situational ethics. For example, people vote for prisons, but they don't want a prison built near them. Likewise, Alinsky contends that people are much more likely to be concerned about issues that affect their lives and with issues that arise close to home. Obviously, these statements are true, but does that mean that people will actually change their moral compass based solely on how near the issue is to them or how much it affects them or people they love directly? To Alinsky, perhaps this makes sense. I contend that while these factors might affect people to some extent, it is not likely to alter their core beliefs. Can anyone envision that the average person would actually resort to murder because a political issue affects them directly? I'm cynical, but even I'm not that cynical. The second rule of the ethics of means and ends is that the judgment of the ethics of means and ends is dependent upon the political position of those sitting in judgment. He cites the use of extreme methods such as assassination by the resistance in Hitler's Germany as examples of how people's sense of morality and ethics would be changed by the political circumstances in which they find themselves. He also mentions the Declaration of Independence and how it is essentially a declaration of war. He points out that the methods of the Founding Fathers would seem extreme by today's standards. Of course, he is correct, but it misses the point entirely. As with many of his rules of the ethics of means and ends, Alinsky equates the need for political change in America to much more dire circumstances in history. Hitler and the American Revolution are examples of boiling points in world history. It is absurd to think that one should use such extreme tactics in situations that clearly do not warrant it. With logic like this, Alinsky would find himself in the position of arguing that parents at a Little League game would be justified in assaulting the umpire if he makes a call against their children. The third rule of the ethics of means and ends is that in war the ends justify almost any means. Alinsky cites Winston Churchill's remarks to his secretary after she asked him if he would find it difficult to support Russia during World War II after being such a strong anti-communist. He replied, quote, not at all. I have only one purpose, the destruction of Hitler, and my life is much simplified thereby. If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons, unquote. He also reminds us that President Lincoln had no problem suspending habeas corpus or using military trials on civilians if necessary. Again, all of this true, but these things happened during war, not because a community organizer was upset about the conditions in some part of an American city. The fourth rule of ethics and means and ends is that the judgment must be made in the context of the times in which the action occurred and not from any other chronological vantage point. Here, Alinsky recalls Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty, Abraham Lincoln's actions during the Civil War, and Thomas Jefferson's change in position regarding national self-interest after becoming president. His point is that different times call for different actions. This rule is essentially no different than his, quote, everything is fair in love and war, unquote, argument. And my response is the same as above. The fifth rule of ethics and means and ends is that concern with ethics increases with the number of means available and vice versa. Alinsky recounts a time when he was embroiled in a conflict with a corporation and people hired by the corporation caught Alinsky in a sexual indiscretion with a young woman. When they threatened to reveal his affair, Alinsky came forward and said, quote, go ahead and give it to the press. I think she's beautiful and I've never claimed to be celibate. Go ahead. Shortly afterwards, someone came forward from within the corporation to offer Alinsky information about a leader of the opposition who was caught in a homosexual indiscretion. Alinsky refused to use the information. Thanks, but forget it. I don't fight that way. I don't want to see it. Goodbye. Alinsky confesses that he would have used the information if it had been the only means available to him, unquote. Alinsky does not base his objection to using such tactics on some sense of morality, but rather on the perceived morality of the people he is trying to influence. This is an important point. Where most conservatives would base their actions on their sense of some absolute moral standard, Alinsky teaches his followers to use the method that is perceived as most moral by the people most important to accomplishing the goal. The object is not to act in a certain way because it is right. The object is to act a certain way because it will garner you the most support for your cause. In other words, expedience trumps morality, or perhaps more correctly, creates morality. Alinsky's crusade against poverty is based on the moral imperative that one must act when confronted with those who are poor and lack political power. Where does Alinsky get this morality? Apparently, he gets it out of thin air, and then discards it when it becomes inconvenient to his noble cause. The sixth rule of ethics of means and ends is that the less important the end to be desired, the more one can afford to engage in ethical evaluations of means. Alinsky offers no comment on this rule, and it is no wonder because it is merely another way to state the same thing as previous rules. Like in times of war, not only is there an acceptance of broader means to effect the desired ends, but the time and effort to consider the means are reduced. No one who wants to make it through the war alive is going to stop on the battlefield to contemplate the moral implications of their actions. The seventh rule of ethics and means and ends is that generally success or failure is a mighty determinant of ethics. This is basically the concept that history is written by the winners. Alinsky goes on to say, quote, "There can be no such thing as a successful traitor, for if one succeeds, he becomes a founding father," unquote. This argument is not without merit. It is true that what future generations believe about a time in history will be greatly influenced by the fact that it is victorious people that will tell the story of what happened. Of course, this was truer in the past than it is now. Today, information travels at the speed of light, and the record of what happens is saved via a myriad of devices such as video cameras, smartphones, computers, and more. The eighth rule of the ethics of means and ends is that the morality of a means depends upon whether the means is being employed at a time of imminent defeat or imminent victory. Alinsky's support of this rule is interesting because it demonstrates a tactic commonly used by Alinsky and by the community organizers who follow his teachings. He uses World War II as an example. Was it the right thing to do to use atomic weapons at the end of World War II? Of course, the justification that President Truman used for dropping the bombs on Japan was that it saved more lives than it took. Japan was not likely to surrender before being completely destroyed. The sheer enormity of the destruction from only 2 bombs caused Japan to blink. Knowing that he was not likely to get much support for any argument that the United States had acted badly by dropping atomic bombs to prevent a protracted war, Alinsky instead uses a hypothetical to make his case. He proposes that if we had possessed the bomb at the time the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, we would have used that weapon against Japan to prevent a world war. This is a common tactic. If you can't make the case sufficiently by a proven example, then create a hypothetical that illustrates your point. It is another way to create a straw man. Alinsky never addresses the idea that desperation is a human reaction and that anyone in possession of superior power is to be held to a higher ethical standard. Apparently, Alinsky is claiming not to see that there are levels of immoral behavior. It is also interesting to note that this rule is a kind of moral declaration. He sees the graduation between times of imminent victory and times of imminent defeat, but he somehow cannot see that morality comes in shades. The inability to recognize that different circumstances may call for different actions, but that those actions are still subject to the ultimate test of absolute morality is baffling. One need not discard moral absolutes to understand that people act in graduations of moral turpitude. The ninth rule of the ethics of means and ends is that any effective means is automatically judged by the opposition as being unethical. Throughout the history of warfare, there have been rules to one extent or another. During the American Civil War, many generals were referred to as having fought a gentlemanly campaign. It is just as true that different countries have been thought of as having engaged in barbaric practices in modern warfare. It sounds odd, perhaps, to classify people in such a way when the object is to kill your enemy, but there is honor to war. The Geneva Conventions attempt to codify what is what is not accepted in a time of war. The Geneva Conventions are defined as, quote, the Geneva Conventions comprise 4 treaties and 3 additional protocols that establish the standards of international law for the humanitarian treatment of the victims of war. The singular term Geneva Convention denotes the agreements of 1949, negotiated in the aftermath of the Second World War, which updated the terms of the first 3 treaties and added a 4th. The Articles of the Fourth Geneva Convention extensively defined the basic rights of prisoners during war, established protections of the wounded, and established protections for civilians in and around a war zone. The treaties of 1949 were ratified, in whole or with reservations, by 194 countries. Well, what are the Geneva Conventions at heart? They are written manifestation of the fact that even during such brutal times as war, mankind finds certain acts to be beyond the pale. Even at its basest moments, mankind takes time to ensure that only the level of suffering that must occur does occur. If we really lived by the maxim, quote, all's fair in love and war, unquote, we would have no Geneva Conventions and no divorce courts for that matter. Man is constantly trying to reach his higher and nobler nature, not his lower and baser. The 10th rule of the ethics of means and ends is that you do what you can with what you have and clothe it with moral garments. There's no question that Alinsky has a valid point when he points out that people often try to clothe their otherwise inexcusable behavior in terms that make them look their best. He even quotes Lenin when he said, quote, the task of the Bolsheviks is to overthrow the imperialist government, but this government rests upon the support of the social revolutionaries and Mensheviks, who in turn are supported by the trustfulness of the masses of people. We are in the minority. In the circumstances, there can be no talk of violence on our side. They have the guns, and therefore we are for peace and for reformation through the ballot. When we have the guns, then it will be through the bullet. The irony here, of course, is that it is the far left that has created oppressive nations such as the Soviet Union, and not the far right. Undoubtedly, someone will chime in here with a Hitler reference, and I would remind them that Hitler came to power through the National Socialist Party. Jonah Goldberg has an excellent book entitled Liberal Fascism. I would recommend this book to the reader even if he or she were not confused regarding Hitler. It is an excellent telling of how socialism and communism have taken root and how the Progressive Party in this country is striving to dig it back up from the ash heap of history even today. As I've noted, history is written by the victors, and it is human nature to put the best possible spin on things. But to claim that the people always act without consideration for anyone else brings cynicism to an entirely new level. It is said that Truman agonized with the idea of dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but determined that not to do so would prolong the war, cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and end up decimating the entire nation of Japan. Likewise, Lyndon Johnson was said to stay up night after night in fits of illness, calling the Pentagon repeatedly to find out how many of our sons had been lost. Every president who has sent men into combat has agonized over his decision both before and after. I cannot imagine a single one of them callously choosing to undertake some war on a foreign soil merely in the hopes that he could clothe his decision in moral arguments at a later date. The cynicism with which Alinsky views the world is at once sad and frightening. One wonders, were he alive today, if Alinsky would subject Obama's decisions to increase troop levels in Afghanistan, to bomb Libya, or to take out Osama bin Laden to the same level of skepticism as that to which George W. Bush was subjected in the preceding 8 years. Would Alinsky, were he alive today, be castigating Obama and claiming that he is acting out of some superpower unilateralism just to clothe his decisions in moral arguments after the fact? I somehow doubt it. And, so it is with the left, Bush was an evil warmonger, even though he got congressional approval for his actions, but Obama is blameless when he did not. Alinsky's 10th rule is not without, just a second here, some merit, and should be considered, but is mostly the thought of a victim who buys into conspiracy theories surrounding government in an attempt to explain away difficult decisions, horrific acts and circumstances that do not fit within their own personal paradigms. To suggest that every moment of progress that has ever occurred to the betterment of man is simply the result of someone deciding that they could get away with it and then claim it was the right thing to do is ludicrous. Did Martin Luther King Jr. begin his crusade for justice for blacks in America with the idea he could do just as he pleases and hope to clothe it in moral garb later? Did Jesus only set out to die on the cross in hopes that he could morally assuage people of his correctness later? I guess Alinsky could have envisioned Gandhi with a machine gun or Mother Teresa with an RPG. Some of Alinsky's teachings just leave us scratching our heads. If Alinsky had lived, he probably would have been trying to arm Occupy Wall Street with weapons and encouraging people to bring munitions to Palestine. The 11th rule of the ethics of means and ends is that goals must be phrased in general terms, like liberty, equality, fraternity, and of common welfare, pursuit of happiness, or bread and peace. Before we begin our discussion here, were you able to read that last rule without thinking of Barack Obama? I mean, after all, what was hope and change you can believe in, if not phrasing goals in general terms? It is interesting to note that Alinsky's discussion of the final rule is all about the fact that one means might lead to another valuable or desirable end. An example, Alinsky says, quote, "It has been previously noted that the wise man of action knows that frequently in the stream of action of means towards ends, whole new and unexpected ends are among the major results of the action. From a civil war fought as a means to preserve the Union came the end of slavery." His point is that the community organizer might not immediately see all the good that can come from his action, and so he should couch his terms in generalities to allow for other or unforeseen ends. Of course, this is exactly what Obama did in the 2008 presidential campaign. By being purposefully vague, he could claim to be unaccountable if he fails to deliver. Moreover, he can anticipate that there may be things to come about later that will be desirable, and he can claim that these were the very things he meant by, quote, hope and change, unquote. Unfortunately, hope and change is not a plan. You can't get hope and change through Congress. So, Obama is stuck with a generality into which he has to pour bad news, not good. As I will mention again later, Alinsky tactics are pretty effective for a candidate running for office, but they fall woefully short for a president seeking to govern. And a couple of things that I wanted to mention. Number one, at the very end there, what he's talking about is the same thing I've mentioned in the past, that the left is excellent when it comes to agitating for change, but once they find themselves and trying to get into power, let's put it that way, that the left is really good at agitating to get into power, but that once they get into power, they're absolutely inept, completely incompetent. They have no idea what to do, and generally they screw things up. And so his last statement here, that hope and change is not a plan, explains why that occurs. So the other thing that he was talking about here, let's see. His point is that the community organizer might not immediately see all the good that can come from his action, so he couches terms in generalities to allow for other unforeseen ends. Of course, this is exactly what Obama did in the 2008 presidential campaign. By being purposefully vague, he could claim to be unaccountable if he fails to deliver. Moreover, and what's another interesting point then is that with you take the complete opposite of that, of President Obama would be President Trump, who was very specific about what it is that he intended to do. He made his campaign's promises very specifically. He had one generality, which was make America great again, but the rest of it was specific. He said he was going to repeal excess regulations, which he did. He says that he's going to build a wall, which still has yet to be done. But again, they're specific. They're measurable. You can tell whether or not he's kept his promise. Whether or not he's made America great again, well, that's just going to be a matter of opinion, I think, in the end, and something that can't be proven. So at this point, that brings us to the conclusion of another episode of The Drill. And until next time, thank you very much for listening, and have a great day.